Do it that well, it should be the whole of the law. Welcome everybody to the next class in our seminar, Little Essays Towards Truth. And we've got two essays by Crowley that we're looking at on laughter and indifference. And these are linked together, and they're linked together under the theme of what Crowley calls the vision or trance of the universal joke. So our job is going to be to try to understand what that means. And I think a very useful way to understand what Crowley means by what he calls the universal joke as the kind of glue that holds these themes together is if I introduce a new philosophical category that we haven't talked about yet that relates to our phenomenological approach towards this material, which is our methodology that guides our inquiry. And that's the theme of irony. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Irony is a way to characterize the way that modern texts and culture are different or distinct from the view of the world, and particularly the way that humor works in pre-modern traditional societies. So critics and cultural theorists will often characterize a kind of shift that occurs in modernity, which is of course, the emergence of a kind of individualistic subjectivity with what we now call capitalist society, and is linked with the expansion of European colonialism as well, and also the post-colonial experience that succeeds or follows that initial globalization. And so what irony is it's a kind of thematized awareness of the ungrounded or open-ended nature of reality, what we might call the abyss of existential freedom, which modern subjects have the option of either owning and taking responsibility for, and what Friedrich Nietzsche would call will to power, or they can flee from the awareness of this open, ungrounded nature of reality, the death of God, if you will. They can flee from this in what Jean-Paul Sartre calls bad faith, which is a kind of, we could characterize as a kind of existential inauthenticity, which is defined by Martin Heidegger in his work Being and Time as a kind of absorption into a kind of inauthentic collectivity, social experience of what Heidegger calls the they self. The German word here is das Man, and it can sometimes be translated as like the one, but in this specific linguistic sense, like you would have the expression one does this or one does that. That's what the das Man means in German. And what that expression indicates is that, let's say you're in a sort of social situation, and the they self, das Man, defines ahead of time what one does in that situation. And so you could just be socially, as it were, on autopilot. You could just go around and do what one does in general society and never give that another thought. And Heidegger is particularly concerned about the way that in modern social life, our possibility for authenticity can be lost through a kind of absorption in a kind of alienated social space where nothing really matters, is just all absorbed in sort of triviality and gossip, and everybody just does what one would do in a kind of common vulgar absorption into that space. And I think all of us can recognize that very much he's talking about the situation in the 1920s, but we can very much recognize that is a feature of our current social media experience. And that it's very easy to kind of get caught up in the triviality of like celebrity gossip or whatever, and just respond as one would respond to that. And when that happens, we lose the kind of unique possibility for being that each of us has as a unique existential, non-repeatable historical event that we can kind of seize the possibilities of our potentiality for being and actualize our more deeper potential. And of course, in Thelema, this is what's called the true will. And I'm identifying that with what Heidegger and the existential tradition in philosophy calls this thing called authenticity, which, just so you know, is a term that originally comes from Soren Kierkegaard. And for him, it's a way to break free from the vulgarity of common life, kind of a similar idea. And for him, a certain type of existentialist Christian faith, he feels, can allow you to become a self in spirit and then be liberated from the vulgarity of the they self, as Heidegger calls it. And Thelema has a very similar kind of spiritual orientation to that. And so I'm combining these ideas together. And so irony is what gives us access to the awareness of this open quality to the world that we have to make meaning out of through our true will to power, authenticity, these various cognate ideas, in contrast with the experience of a traditional pre-modern society where the meaning of the world is already circumscribed. If you live in a traditional society, you're part of a particular social class, you're not socially mobile, and your potentiality for being is determined by your class in that sense, and your role in society, and this is all predetermined and given. If you're a king or a member of the nobility, you already know who you are, what you're supposed to be doing. If you're a peasant, you're just a peasant, and you already know what that means and what you're supposed to do, and you can't leave that role and do something else. Whereas in modern societies, we aren't pre-given these roles. Instead, in capitalist society, we have to sell our labor on the market, and then that determines what our role is. But that's determined in a more complicated and open-ended way than is experienced in a traditional society, where those social ties are broken down by the labor market in modernity. And people leave their villages, and they leave their farm, and they go to the big city, and they have to find their fortune, like in any good Charles Dickens novel. Great expectations, indeed. So irony is distinct from the two traditional modes of ancient, you could say, drama or literature, which are, of course, tragedy and comedy. And there are, of course, more modernized versions of both of these, but if we can it's useful to make this comparison. So irony is distinct from traditional or classical tragedy in an ancient sense, in this way. So in ancient tragedy, and by this I mean like Greek or Roman tragedy, but then this is also the case in medieval tragedy. It's Shakespeare where this starts to break down and get reconfigured. So in ancient tragedy, what's going on is that there's a kind of pious awe that's being invoked through the catharsis of the tragedy before the fate or destiny that's decreed for mortals by the gods. And this is not evadable. And this is because for pre-modern societies, time is cyclical or closed. And so this is a concept of history or temporality that's distinct from the open experience of temporality that's available to modern subjects. So an example of this would be, for example, the character of Hamlet is there. In Shakespeare's play, Hamlet is structured sort of like an ancient tragedy, but the character of Hamlet represents modern subjectivity, and so that's why they sort of can't make up their mind, because they actually, unlike a tragic subject in an ancient play, Hamlet can actually decide what they want to do because they're a modern subject. And so they're confused by this over the course of the play, which is that the choice that they have to make is that they have to own their destiny rather than just have it be given to them. They have to make the choice. to do that. And this is a kind of new dramatic situation that Shakespeare is kind of developing for the first time. Okay, so that's tragedy. What about comedy? Okay. Modern irony can be understood as a change in the way comedy functions in a pre-modern versus a modern context. So, in pre-modern comedies, the moral framing of action is fixed, and it assumes that the basic rightness of the given social order and its class system. So comedy, in a traditional context, therefore consists in the mockery of social difference. People who aren't conforming to what the expected social norms are and are failing to fulfill their roles are the objects of humor and laughter. They're to be mocked and humiliated. And so, and this is represented by the various types who embody this rejected social difference. So this would be the type of the clownish, the clowning around slaves, or the villainous Jew, or the and so forth. And so instead, in contrast, in modern comedy, however, humor arises from the disclosure of the gaps and fissures in the established social norms that are presumed. And so these gaps or fissures, when what's assumed to be socially normative is shown to be incomplete, and this is revealed through the dramatic situation of character action. This is then found to be humorous. This is funny because it reveals irony, the irony of presuming that these norms are complete or whole, whereas in fact they're filled with all kinds of contradictions and fissures. And what this implies is that there's a kind of experience of distancing that the modern subject then experiences towards social normativity as such. And that's what irony is. It's this kind of intuitive, again, it's like one of Heidegger's Befindlichkeit. It's a state of being or a kind of precognitive awareness where we're, as modern subjects, we're already unconsciously, as it were, aware that social normativity is incomplete that surrounds us. And so we automatically have a kind of critical distance towards it that is often expressed through humor, where we'll make like in sarcasm or whatever, where we're trying to fit into a particular social situation, but we know that the social normativity that would allow us to do that is a little bit incomplete, and so we have to kind of maneuver our way, and we'll use humor or sarcasm to kind of bring to our awareness that ambiguity and then be able to kind of work with that. And this is very different than the way that the experience of being a person works in a traditional society, where that kind of irony would in fact be considered a little bit wicked. It would not be appropriate. Whereas for modern, because you're mocking social norms that are presumed to be given by God and religion and that are to be obeyed and respected, whereas as modern subjects, we know that respect for social norms has to involve an element of kind of negotiation, as it were, because we know that not everybody is automatically going to agree with what's supposed to happen in any given social situation, and we're okay with that. We know that that's the way that our world works, and that if we encounter social differences, that doesn't imply that those people are bad and have to be punished. We have to like figure out how to work with them, as it were. And so this would be represented again in Shakespeare in, I think a good example of this would be the comedy, The Merchant of Venice, where there's Shylock, who's the character who represents one of these traditional, character types, and he's the character type of the villainous Jew. And this is based on an earlier Christopher Marlowe play, which was a big hit when Shakespeare was young, which was called The Jew of Malta. And there's this, again, a villainous Jew character who has a speech that the crowds loved where he explains how he loves to poison wells and that people drink from and stuff like that, and what a terrible, nasty person he is. And everybody loved this villainous character. who's the basis for like Richard III, for example, and other early Shakespeare villain characters. What Shakespeare does in The Merchant of Venice is he's saying, I can do one better than Marlowe. I can have a Jewish villain character who is a villain. Shylock is the bad guy in this play, but he's portrayed with a depth of character that while you're watching this, it calls into question the anti-Semitism surrounding people's judgments of the social difference represented by Judaism versus presumed Christian Gentile normativity. And so it's one of the great feats of drama that Shakespeare is able to have what is, for all intents and purposes, a straight up stereotypical Jewish villain character that would have been recognized by anybody in his audience, but then give this character kind of depth and pathos that involves an element of modern irony. And that's the innovative element in this play and what makes it a modern play. Okay, so then laughter. Then for Crowley, comes out of a state of being, again, this Befindlichkeit, this precognitive horizontal orientation that is what he calls trance or vision, and is oriented in terms of this kind of ironic distancing towards our experience as a whole, not just part of our experience, but experience as such. The world as such is experienced as a kind of ironic, incomplete totality that we're not able to like have complete sincerity towards. We have to have a certain amount of distancing towards. And this is what he means by the theme of the trance or vision of the universal joke. And it implies to this universality of irony that we kind of tune into when we analyze our experience and discover that the life world in its wholeness has a kind of innate, incomplete quality to it. And this is what Jacques Lacan calls the real with a capital R. It is the quality of an incompleteness to reality, that reality itself is in some sense fissured, incomplete and lacking in a kind of ability to totalize itself. And therefore it's open-ended, and we can have existential freedom and creativity, and we can make ourselves we can fulfill our potential due to that openness. So that openness is both tragic and comedic at the same time. And that's the vision of the universal joke. And so in that sense, it's parallel to the distinction between the vision of sorrow and the vision of wonder, which are also kind of flip sides of the same coin. And that's why Crowley has these two chapters following the chapters where he's talking about sorrow and wonder, and then he's talking about laughter and indifference, as again, a way to sort of capture this same idea of how in modern experience, we can't go back to the dualistic supernatural worldview of traditional societies where God has determined what the truth with a capital T is, and we just have to obey that. God is dead for modern subjects, and we have to make our own values in will to power, and we seek our deepest potential to being to do that if we're authentically tuning into our potentiality for being. Or we can be lost in the triviality of the vulgar media culture that surrounds us, and we can not fulfill our potential because it's up to us. So magic with a K is a tool to allow us then, in that context, which is the context of modern life and modern experience, to find our true will and fulfill our deepest authenticity for being. So the joke, again, just to repeat the same point again, the joke in question with regards to the universal joke, which is then the basis for either laughter or indifference, is the awareness of the ungrounded quality of our judgments, in the sense that they are ultimately our judgments, and they're not justified by a supernaturally imposed moral order that lacks any ambiguity. For if reality is the all, if nature is everything, and we are the self-conscious awareness of that all, the all with a capital A being what Crowley calls Pan, which is the all, which is nature, which we are the self-conscious expression of. We're Pan, we're the we're the all-knowing itself, then what this means is that the world is what we make of it in will to power. And so we seek then, or have the ability to seek the authenticity of that. So let me share the screen and let's just take a look at the, whoops, it's dropped off. Let me, just a moment. Let's try that again. There we go. Ta-da. Okay. Stephen, if you could please read our first paragraph here.
Sure, just 1 second. Okay, so the common defect of all mystical systems, previous to that of the Aeon whose laws thelema, is that there has been no place for laughter, but the sadness of the mournful mother and the melancholy of the dying man are swept into the limbo of the past by the confident smile of the immortal child.
So there's no room for irony in the past. People know what the truth is, and they just have to obey it and fulfill their role in society. Okay, Hillary, if you could keep going where it says, and there is no vision.
Alrighty. And there is no vision more critical in the career of the adept of Horus than the universal joke.
Keep going.
Keep going? Okay.
Yes.
In this trance, he accepts fully the formula of Osiris, and in the act transcends it. The spear of the centurion passes harmlessly through his heart, and the sword of the executioner strikes idly on his neck. He discovers that the tragedy of which so many centuries have made such a case is but a farce for children's pleasure. Punch is knocked down only to get up grinning with his gay root toot toot toot, here we are again. Judy, the beetle, the hangman, and the devil are merely the companions of his playtime.
So this is the Punch and Judy puppet show, right? We've all seen that, where Punch has this stick and he beats Judy up. And then, but because she's a cartoon character, of course, she's immortal, so she just gets up again. And then he has to beat her, and that's the joke. So, Henry, could you keep reading where it says, so since, after all.
So since, after all, the facts which he thought tragic are real enough, the essence of his solution is that they are not true, as he thought of himself. They are just one set of phenomena, as interesting and as fatuously impotent to affect him as any other set. His personal grief was due to his passionate insistence on contemplating one insignificant congeries of events as if it were the sole reality and importance in the infinite mass of manifestation. It is thus that the perception of the universal joke leads directly to the understanding of the idea of self as coterminous with the universe, and at the same time one with it, creator of it, and aloof from it, which triune state is, as is well known, one of the most necessary stages of samadhi. It is the culmination of one of the two most important chapters of the Bhagavad Gita.
Okay, let's pause there. So I don't know if the triune state is as well known, one of the most necessary stages of samadhi, since he's just introducing it here. But let's talk about what he means by that. Okay, so what is this triune state that he means? So this, what he's basically going to be talking about is three different aspects towards which you can contemplate the vision of the universal joke as related to, again, this theme of laughter and indifference. So to achieve this gnosis, you have to dissolve not the phenomenal appearance of the limited sense of self, which is separate from the all. So you don't like lose your sense of continuing to manifest as like a person in history. That's still there, but the meaning of that shifts and deepens and changes. So for this is one of the facts that Crowley notes are real enough on their own relative plane. Okay, so what are we trying to do then? Rather, what we're trying to do is to dissolve one's limiting sense of exclusive identification with the limited personal self. which, as the Buddhists correctly point out, has no permanently abiding existence. But the all does have a permanently abiding existence, not as a substantive unity, because this was excluded on all planes by the Buddhist insight into nothingness, into annotment. But the all does have a permanently abiding universal existence as a kind of eternally dynamic, self-negating nothingness that is infinitely productive of all four. And this is what Aleister Crowley calls the Kabbalistic zero, which is the absolute, if you will, of his system. It's his version of the Buddhist Shunyata. Okay, so then mystically, as one contemplates this ultimate truth, if you will, concerning reality, one can achieve a kind of one-pointed awareness, or in phenomenological terms, the manifestation of particular phenomenological state of being, pre or anti-cognitive orientation, that allows one to orient the whole framing of one's experience into three aspects of this kind of self-mediated truth. And then these three are one in the sense that they're all aspects of each other. And of course, this then is another way of talking about or relating these to the supernal triad of the tree of life. So first is the universal joke as a version of the trance of either sorrow or wonder, which dissolves the identity or identification with the limited self. And this corresponds to Bina. Second, once that dissolution of identification with the immediate self occurs, that's replaced with two things. First, corresponding to Hokmah, which is the sense of a kind of true selfhood as aloof from and detached from the totality of the life world of phenomenal appearances. This is what Crowley calls indifference. So then there's a sense of, again, irony, of a kind of aloofness or innate separation of the self in this broader sense from the totality of the phenomenal life world. And so Crowley identifies this with what in Vedanta is called Atman Darshana, or the view of the Atman, or the true self beyond or behind the phenomenal experience of the ego self. And this is what he's referring to when he talks about the Bhagavad Gita, because at the climax of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna declares that he is both the universe and that he also at the same time abides as its separate Lord. And the experience of one's own consciousness or mind as being, or existence as having the same divine quality is what Crowley's talking about with indifference, or this second phase. Then number three, this experience of Atman Darshana in turn ripens and matures into a further analysis in which this separate divine self, or Atman, is also disclosed as having an ontology characterized by nothingness. And this is what Crowley calls Shiva Darshana, or the opening of the eye of Shiva, which destroys everything. And this means that the remaining subtle sense of separation from the all is also in turn dissolved, so that the mystic becomes one with the all, but on the basis of a nothingness that is non-dual with the appearance of duality. And this is the ultimate position of Thelema, a kind of dialectical synthesis of the two previous positions. First, the trance of sorrow, which is the position of Buddhism, and then the experience of the Atman as the abiding separate Lord from reality, which is the experience of Vedanta in the Hindu tradition. And these two are synthesized and then transcended with a kind of what Crowley uses the deeper position of Thelema, which is this position of Shiva Darshana. And this is what he means in this paragraph here. This is the triune state. Perception of the universal joke. That's Bina, which is the vision of sorrow. And that dissolves the limited identification with the phenomenal ego self. Okay, and that leads directly to the understanding of the idea of self as conterminous with the universe. Okay, that's the abiding as the separate Lord, the experience of Atman, a kind of ironic distancing or separation of a kind of self with a capital S from the totality of experience. But at the same time, you are one with it, creator of it, which is then the identification with the all, the capital A, the identification with Pam, the all, which we are the self-conscious expressions of. And that's the triune state, which is the, when this becomes one-pointed or intuitive, meaning you don't have to like try to posit it consciously, your state of being is aligned with this understanding. And that is then samadhi. And it's the culmination of the mystical path, as understood in Thelema. And this is represented by what Crowley calls the 0 = 2 formula, where the false unity of traditional dualistic metaphysics, meaning the supernaturally positive divine God or unity that's seen as being in another world, has dropped out of the equation. And what's left is the identification of the two, which is the experience of the phenomenal life world with our embedded subjectivity as part of that world. Subject, object, self, world, that's the two. But that's equivalent to the Kabbalistic 0, which is expressed through these this triune state of the represented by the supernals of these 3 different viewpoints that you could have on it. And then the idea is that you're supposed to contemplate that, and then your understanding of that deepens, and then you achieve what in Buddhism is called prajna, which is this deep intuitive understanding of that condition as being your ultimate identity. And this is then equivalent to, this is the gnosis. This is the self-realization that then is gives you the understanding of who you are, such that you can then determine what you're doing in accord with the true will. And for Crowley, you don't just contemplate this. You're supposed to do something with it. And that is the quest for the true will in magic. Okay, so the rest of this chapter is a little bit digressive, and we're actually going to kind of skip it. And feel free to, there's some quotations from Robert Browning and a few other things. But what I want to do that's a little bit more back to Crowley's philosophical argument is I want to pick up again with this next chapter, which is on indifference. Okay, so indifference is the state of being of this kind of dynamic detachment towards the phenomenological life world that expresses the attainment of the gnosis of this triune state. So the limited sense of self having been dissolved, the psyche achieves a condition of a kind of vacuum state from which the true will emerges as what Crowley calls the voice in the silence. Stephen, if you could read this first paragraph, please.
The state of mind which is characterized by indifference is commonly called trance, but the misnomer is unfortunate. It is, in fact, a sense of the precise contrary of a trance, for trance usually implies samadhi, and that state specifically excludes any such occurrence. That implies a uniting, and this is a willed dissociation, yet there is nothing herein to suggest necessarily any practice of the Black Brothers, for it is not, properly speaking, an attainment, but rather a convenient attitude. And it is one of the very greatest practical importance in use.
So what he's saying here is that this could be a little bit misleading. He's not saying that this is like in contradiction to samadhi. He's saying that you start out with samadhi as kind of like a deep, profound experience, but that it needs to become automatic. It needs to become habitual so that you're not just experiencing this when you're in meditation. It's your basic orientation towards life. Keep going.
One cannot remain indefinitely in any samadhi. At any time, at the same time, it is proper to fill the intervals between gusts of positive work in such a way to leave oneself as free as possible to take the next step. One should therefore cultivate a habit of mind which is not bound by any form of desire. The state of indifference is thus a form of that silence which is defense and protection, and is cognate with the third noble truth of Buddhism, sorrow ceasing.
Okay, so first noble truth of Buddhism, existence is suffering. Second noble truth, suffering is caused by selfish craving, meaning identification with a limited sense of self. Identification with the idea that your experience of self is permanently abiding, which is a false idea. Third noble truth, all suffering can cease through the disidentification with that false sense of identity. So this is the kind of indifference that Crowley is talking about, but he wants it to be dynamic. This isn't just something where you sit in a hut in the jungle in India and you dissolve yourself into the samadhi of nothingness. This is intended to be a kind of orientation in which you're actively involved with your day-to-day life in projects and concerns that you are positing for yourself in will to power. And then fulfilling your full potentiality for being as a modern subject in a technological society, where you're not just a peasant, where you don't have anything to do except farm work, or you can become a renunciate if you want to escape from that. We have more options as modern subjects. So back to this idea of the true will as emerging from this condition of indifference as a kind of as the dynamic aspect of this kind of silence, which grounds you in a condition of indifference where you're not just vacillating with the events that are occurring to you, but you can remain focused on your true will. Okay, but what is that? How does that emerge? Because it seems that we're evacuating desire from the psyche, and yet the true will is definitely a will. It is a desire that we're having, that's manifesting. Okay, here it's useful to introduce another philosophical distinction. And this is what Sigmund Freud calls the drive, or sometimes the death drive. And in his late theory of the two instinctual drives, he contrasts the libidinal dynamic of the psyche with what he calls the death instincts, which is, so let me put it this way. The psyche's kind of base level functioning is in terms of the libido, which is affectivity or desire. And according to Freud, the libidinal dynamic of the psyche, its affectivity, seeks what he calls the pleasure principle, meaning it seeks a kind of lowest level of excitation, a kind of equilibrium where it can even out the disturbing vacillations of desire and achieve a kind of quietude. And Freud contrasts this with the drive, which is a disruption of that equilibrium. And unlike the libido, which seeks the pleasure principle, the drive seeks what Freud calls the reality principle. Namely, it seeks engagement with the complexities of the larger social world that the psyche is historically embedded in, and it seeks the development of the psyche through the creation of new knowledge and the deepening of its abilities and understanding. And so rather than seeking a kind of equilibrium, the drive is a kind of disequilibrium that disrupts that stasis. But it can emerge from that kind of evacuation of the psyche. And so the ideal here is that normally we have these kind of vacillations of our immediate desire, but through meditation, if we can quiet those down so that through the pleasure principle, they achieve a kind of equilibrium, then the drive will the death drive of the true will then emerge out of that vacuum state. And this is a bit like the philosopher Slavoj Žižek compares this to, in quantum mechanics, the way that this is described by what's called the Higgs boson particle. It's part of the Schrodinger equation, but to sort of describe this in the most minimalist possible way, basically what happens is that the minimum energy state that you can achieve is actually just slightly lower if you precipitate a particle out of a vacuum. So you could never achieve a complete state of like absolute zero temperature, because if you remove all energy from a volume of space, as that vacuum is becoming perfect, it turns out when you do the math that it's a slightly more perfect vacuum if there's a particle that precipitates energetically out of that vacuum state. And so what that means is that the more you evacuate things, it causes stuff to appear and manifest itself. And this is the case not only in particle physics, but also for Freud's view of psychology, and also for Crowley's view of magic. Yoga quiets the self so that the dynamic motion of the true will can then authentically emerge from the unconscious in its most pure form. And then this is the ideal of the voice of the silence, the communication of the holy guardian angel to the adept. The voice in the silence is then the communication, the self-manifestation of this of the true will from out of this evacuation of the self. The disidentification with the false self that's given by the they self of the phenomenal life world, the vulgar sense of self that's just immediately given by society. And then you quiet that, disidentify that, and then your true self can then emerge spontaneously from that quieting. Okay, Hillary, could you read this second paragraph starting the general idea of the state?
All righty. The general idea of the state is that the mind should react automatically to each and every impression. It does not matter whether the event be aye or nay. Blavatsky observes that the feeling is at least tinged with disgust. But this is an error. Such a state is imperfect. There should, on the contrary, be a quite definite joy, not in the impression itself, but in being indifferent to it. This joy springs doubtless from the sense of power involved, but that is again an imperfection. One should rather rejoice in the cognizance of the ultimate truth that existence is pure joy, not in any feeling more immediately.
Okay, this is combining all of the ideas that we've been talking about. There should be, he says, a quite definite joy that comes from indifference. And this joy springs from the sense of power involved. This is Nietzsche's will to power. But it is the cognizance of the ultimate truth. What is the ultimate truth? Existence is pure joy, which is the flip side of the first noble truth. And in fact, the ultimate truth of the first noble truth, that existence is suffering, existence is imperfect, existence is incomplete, that there's a sense of irony. As we realize that, we're led to the trance of sorrow, the trance of the universal joke, but this gives rise to the trance of wonder because this is the basis for our creative freedom. And one of Freud's basic insights that is then articulated more clearly, or less clearly perhaps, by Jacques Lacan, is what Lacan calls jouissance. And this is the state of being, the Befindlichkeit, that arises from the emergence of the drive. And it can be described as an impersonal sense of blissful joy that is inherent to the psyche's existence as a phenomenon. In other words, the kind of deepest discovery of psychoanalysis, as well as of yoga and Buddhism and Thelema, is that the ultimate kind of selfless nature of the self is pure bliss or joy. And this is what in yoga is meant when it's said that Atman, or the ultimate self, is characterized by the three qualities of being bliss and existence. I think maybe I'm getting that wrong, but this one, Ananda, or bliss, is the one that Crowley is calling attention to here. And this is what Lacan calls jouissance. And this is experienced by the fact that when you strip away all the veils of the self, and you disidentify with the limited day-to-day, everyday sense of self, you're left not with just a void that is evacuated of everything, but that this very process of evacuation actually creates a kind of negative energy state that causes energy and form to manifest. And that this process, this dynamic, unstoppable, innate process that is kind of the ultimate horizon of reality, why there's something rather than nothing, is innately joyful, innately ecstatic, innately blissful. In other words, existence is pure joy at its bottom, ultimately. And that this can be directly experienced in magic and mysticism. And then furthermore, that you can identify your actual ultimate being with this blissful joy, what Lacan calls jouissance. And that from that point of view, all the shadows pass and are done. The vacillations of the phenomenal sense become tolerable, and you can then have this kind of dynamic indifference that allows you then to face any situation. And what's important about that is that we're going to skip the next paragraph, and then is that Crowley now has an interesting example to explain how this works. Henry, can you read where it starts? Yet it would not be fair.
Yet it would not be fair to say that the state of indifference was akin to that dullness which succeeds the acute spasm of sorrow. It is not the anesthesia of a nerve worn out by excess of pain. There is never any place in the curriculum of a magician for passivity. Of course, we here accept what may be called the active or willed passivity described in Liber 65.
That just means meditation, where you're willing yourself to be quiet strategically as a kind of like exercise. Keep going.
Indifference is to be an intensely active condition. One may compare it with the ease of a skilled fencer who meets and deflects every possible attack of his antagonist with equal vigor, unconscious of his acts, because he has trained his eye, wrist, and even his blade to think for themselves. Thus, indifference is the spiritual form of the automatic consciousness of the adept, and this resides in Yesod, the place of the fortress on the frontier of the abyss, as described in Liber 418 in the 11th Aether.
Okay, and then we have these three little aphorisms that summarize that. Stephen, if you could read these to us.
There we go. The following sorites may prove useful to the aspirant. Existence is only to be understood as a continuum. All parts of existence are therefore ultimately equivalent, each being equally necessary to complete the whole. Each event is thus to be received with equal honor, and the reaction to make it with equal indifference.
Okay, so there you go. There's the kind of summary of what he's trying to get at. There's more in this chapter. We don't have time to get into it. There's always more to look at in all of these writings. What I want to do now in our last 10 minutes is open to questions. And let's talk about what we've been doing, because I've introduced, again, as I'm always doing, some complicated philosophical concepts, and I haven't been given us enough time to ask questions and talk about that in the last few classes. So I want to stop a little bit sooner this time, even if it means we're not looking at the full chapter, and let's have a little chance to talk about and discuss these ideas, just to make sure that you're as, if not completely clear, at least clearer about these ideas than not. So are there any confusions or questions about some of these admittedly complicated ideas that we've been talking about? Anybody who wants to talk?
Yeah, I think I have a question.
Yes, please.
Of like how the trance of sorrow maybe relates to the dark night of the soul and what the overlap or lack of overlap there is between those two terms.
Yeah, I think they're actually very directly comparable, especially in the Christian mystical tradition. Setting aside the medieval period, let's go ahead and look in the early modern period with someone like John of the Cross, who's sometimes thought of as a medieval figure, but actually he's in the 1600s, so he's actually a modern figure. He's part of what's of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the revival of monasticism in the Spanish Empire at this time. So he's actually contemporary with like the Jesuits. Anyway, so his concept of the dark night of the soul is that through prayer and mortification, you evacuate your limited sense of self. And the idea here comes from medieval scholasticism, which is that the soul is a mirror of God. And this is a Platonic idea because the idea is that in Platonism, the soul is like so there's the realm of the divine forms, and the souls of things are those forms. And so the kind of spark or part of the divine that's in you is your soul. And so, and for John of the Cross, that's equivalent to like your mind. So you could say your consciousness or sense of self-conscious awareness. So the idea is to disidentify yourself with thinking of your mind or consciousness as being your particular, person with its narrative or story that's limited by the, conventional social role that you're playing in society around you. But then from that emerges a kind of blissful joy, because you then realize that what's left is God. What's left is a kind of pure noetic presence that can take on dynamically any form, and that this is your ultimate self. Because your soul is a kind of spark or part of God. And so in a sense, when you remove mental distractions from your soul, you discover that your soul is in some sense already in God. And in fact, although John of the Cross would not say this because that would be heretical, it is God. And so this is the awareness that you're trying to achieve through what he calls the dark night of the soul, which is a kind of purgative stage of mysticism, but then it leads to what's then called the unitive stage of mysticism, where you achieve a kind of sense of unification with the divine universal spirit. So that would be the point of connection between these traditions.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, Hillary, Henry, do you have any questions? Anything we want to talk about a little bit more?
No, I'm sorry, Nathan. I confess that I have to listen to each one of these lectures over and over again before it starts making any sense at all to me.
Okay. We don't have to have it all make sense, but there might be some little idea or thought that I might be able to make more clear to you.
Well, you're working pretty well on it. I'm less annoyed with Crowley.
Okay, good. I'm just trying to show the way that he connects with this larger body of ideas. And Crowley sometimes when he writes is a little bit too clever for his own good. And so it's helpful to kind of slow down, and then I don't know if how I'm talking can maybe be described that way, but to try to connect up his ideas with this sort of larger conversation that's occurring around him. And in that sense, we can see the way that Crowley is actually a very typical kind of high modernist intellectual, like say T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound or Heidegger or Sartre, or one of these, Simone de Beauvoir, one of these philosophers from this period. And that actually he's very much on the same wavelength with these people in terms of the ideas that he has and the kind of way that he's treating certain themes, and also the way that he's taking a whole body of traditional lore and material and updating it for modernity. So that rather than seeming outdated and useless, some of these like traditional spiritualities can in fact function again in modernity for us when we're not medieval peasants anymore. And so they can't have the same meaning that they did for medieval people for us.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying that you're giving the context
Yes, context is everything.
that Crowley was working within, and because I know nothing about this stuff. This has not been an area that I've ever studied. So I'm just dog paddling around the edges at this point, but it is useful and interesting and sparking conversations in my
Great.
life.
And you know, we have this wonderful tool now called the internet where you can take any of the terminology that I'm just kind of throwing out, and you can go on Wikipedia and you can type it in and it'll give you a whole bunch of little additional information about it where you can see, oh, this is what this means, and so on. Henry, did you have anything you wanted to?
Well, one quick one. Speaking
Yes,
of term-
please.
You spell jouissance?
Jouissance. It's a
Jouis-
French word. It just means sort of like joy or bliss, but it has this kind of connotation of a kind of illegality to it. So like the Marquis de Sade, his sadism is a kind of jouissance because it's a represents a kind of emotion that you're kind of like not supposed to acknowledge that you're having, even though you're having it. So this could be like queerness is a kind of jouissance in a traditional like heterosexual normative context. It's a kind of desire that you have that you're not supposed to have, but that is nevertheless deeply authentic and necessary for yourself as a deep expression of who you are. And there's all kinds of other modalities sort of like that. Sadism or other types of emotions that we have. And Crowley's point is that these are all part of ourself and we have to like own and make use of them. And if we just disavow them, then we become neurotic. And and there's what Sigmund Freud calls the return of the repressed. And so if we try to suppress these parts of our being, we won't succeed. That we'll just make ourselves crazy. And so we need to acknowledge them. And then as Lacan says, we have to enjoy our symptom, meaning that we have to develop appropriate modes of coping strategies to deal with the psyche's innate neurotic quality vis-a-vis what the larger social expectations are of who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do, which are ultimately not completely fulfillable. And so we need to find our authenticity by connecting with the parts of ourselves that we would normally be expected to disavow or ignore, or to go into the unconscious and dig these up and find a constructive way to relate to them, as opposed to just acting out and going crazy. There's a healthy way to do that rather than an unhealthy way. And magic with a K is a way to do that. So we have to, as Allen Ginsberg says, don't hide the madness. You've got to, figure out what the trauma is in your being and figure out how to heal that by acknowledging it rather than just shoving it back down into the unconscious. And so jouissance is the emotion, the ecstasy that you experience when you can own and release these emotions, when you can allow yourself to experience them. Again, not in a way that you're just acting out crazily, but in a way that you can accept that these are in fact part of the wholeness of who you are. And part of owning kind of the all with a capital A, that you can accept that these are part of your experience and you can find a way to relate with them constructively.
So,
yes, Stephen.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so often we talk about trance as something that happens is like a pseudo, like in meditation or samadhi, but it seems like what we're talking about here is permanent change to worldview.
Yes, and the point that Crowley's making,
dynamic one,
built on
and
top of each other, right?
yes.
Like that's really what we're talking about.
And we are running out of time, so I'll just end with this thought, which is that trance is not ultimately for Crowley a special state that's separate from our everyday cognition. It should become something that's woven into our very everyday, normal, everyday psychology and experience. It describes our basic state of being towards the world that we can adjust to improve and express our deepest authenticity. It's 4 o'clock, so thank you everybody for joining us for this session of the class, and we're going to continue this next week. So I hope all of you will consider coming back and joining us for that. Thank you all. Love is the law. Love under well.
93.